My name is Silas. Welcome to Brookline Booksmith's author event series. A few housekeeping notes. Thank you for keeping your phones on silent. If you haven't picked up a pre-ordered book and you'd like to buy a book, you can do so in the back after the event. There will be time for a Q&A, so please get your questions ready. We're here tonight to celebrate the release of Time's Echo, the Second World War, the Holocaust, and the Music of Remembrance, with author Jeremy Eichler in conversation with our moderator, James Parker. James Parker is a staff writer for The Atlantic and the editor of The Pilgrim, a literary magazine for the homeless community in downtown Boston. We're so fortunate to host him and that very community, the Black Seed Writers Group, last night in this very spot for readings from The Pilgrim issue 51. Welcome, James.
Thank you.
Jeremy is an award-winning critic and cultural historian who currently serves as the chief classical music critic for the Boston Globe. He's the recipient of an ASCAP Deems Taylor Award for writing published in The New Yorker, a fellowship at Harvard's Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Study, and a public scholars grant at the National Endowment for the Humanities. Formerly a critic for the New York Times and a contributor to many other national publications, he holds a PhD in modern European history from Columbia University. Welcome, Jeremy. Time's Echo is a stirring account of how music bears witness to history and carries forward the memory of wartime past. In 1785, when the great German poet Friedrich Schiller penned his immortal Ode to Joy, he crystallized the deepest hopes and dreams of the European Enlightenment for a new era of peace and freedom, a time when millions would be embraced as equals. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony gave wing to Schiller's words, but barely a century later, these same words were claimed by Nazi propagandists and twisted by a barbarism so complete that it ruptured as one philosopher put it, the deep layer of solidarity among all those who wear a human face. When it comes to how societies remember these increasingly distant dreams and catastrophes, we often think of history books, archives, documentaries, or memorials carved from stone. But in Time's Echo, Eichler makes a passionate and revelatory case for the power of music as culture's memory, an art form uniquely capable of carrying forward meaning from the past. With a critic's ear, a scholar's erudition, and a novelist's eye for detail, Eichler shows how four towering composers, Richard Strauss, Arnold Schoenberg, Dmitri Shostakovich, and Benjamin Britten, lived through the era of the Second World War and the Holocaust, and later transformed their experiences into deeply moving, transcendent works of music, scores that echo lost time. Here to tell us more are James Parker and Jeremy Eichler.
Thank you, Silas. That was a really good intro. That actually took half of my intro. So here we go. I'm very excited to be here, talking to Jeremy about his book. To be the Q to your age, Jeremy, is a great honour, and I'm very flattered. Given my championship level of ignorance in the arena of classical music. Jeremy has been educating me over the course of our friendship, and with this book, my education continues. I think this is a monumental piece of work, and by that I don't just mean that it's got heft and scope and weight and all the other monumental type virtues. I think it stands as a monument in the imagination, a shaping, transformative act of remembrance It's a monument to the artists and the sufferers and the dead. It's a monument to people caught in history, caught under history. It's a monument to music. And beneath this monument, certain kinds of beauty are interred, never to rise again, while around it, other newer kinds of beauty are at work. And that, I hope, is what we're going to get into in our conversation. But to get everyone in the mood, as we begin, I'm going to ask Jeremy to read to us from the very opening pages of Time's Echo, because I think with this passage, he really explains what he's up to in this book. Take it away, Jeremy Eichler.
First of all, thank you so much to the Booksmith for having us here tonight. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here, and thank you to the fusion of mind and heart and moral audacity that is James Parker for being my conversation partner tonight. I feel like it's an honor for me to call James not just a writer I admire, but a friend. And he had the dubious distinction of being present at some of the less elegant moments of Time's Echo's creation and long gestation period, and James to be in James' company as a friend is sort of, I was thinking, is sort of like receiving a kind of existential bear hug, and every ounce of that support went somewhere deep. So thank you so much, James.
These booming kind of noises are quite impressive.
Okay. So this is from the prelude of Time's Echo. It's called In the Shade of the Oak. The wooded slopes of the Ettersberg stand in the center of Germany, a few miles north of Weimar. Beginning in the 18th century, the area served as the playground of dukes who went there for hunting, and later as the preserve of poets who traversed its rugged hills while contemplating the wonders of nature. No less an eminence than Goethe, the greatest of all German poets, traveled often to the forest of the Ettersberg, and often over the years, he grew particularly fond of one large oak tree near a clearing with expansive views of the countryside. On a bright autumn morning in 1827, a banquet-like breakfast was laid out in the shade of this grand oak. Leaning against its regal trunk, Goethe feasted on roast partridges, drank wine from a gold cup, and gazed out at the rolling landscape. Here, he declared, a person feels great and free, the way he should always be. After Goethe's death, as a cult of reverence formed around him as the standard bearer of both German genius and European humanism, the legend of his favorite local tree evidently survived all the way down to one summer day more than a century later. That day in 1937, a group of prisoners was led into the same high forests of the Ettersberg, stopping at a limestone ridge just 6 miles north of Weimar. Under harsh conditions and with minimal equipment, these men cleared away the trees to make room for a concentration camp. As the prisoners labored day after day, building their own future prison, their guards identified one particular oak that would not be felled. This oak, it was determined, must be the mythic Goethe's oak. And so the anointed tree was left standing, and in the years that followed, the concentration camp of Buchenwald rose up around it on all sides. To the Nazis who created Buchenwald, Goethe's oak represented a tangible link to German history at its most illustrious, a history that proved the German people's cultural superiority while pointing toward the 1,000-year empire of their dreams. To the inmates of Buchenwald, the tree took on different meanings as an incongruous vestige of the older Germany, a potent reminder of European culture's utopian promise, and a silent witness to unspeakable crime. Over the course of the next 7 years, the men and women in the surrounding camp were enslaved, murdered, and worked to death. Some of Hitler's victims, according to one account, were hanged from the branches of Goethe's tree. The oak itself eventually stopped producing leaves. In one photograph taken by a prisoner with a stolen camera, its branches appear skeletal and bare, reaching up into the empty sky. Some prisoners linked the tree's fate with that of Nazi Germany, which by the summer of 1944 was careening towards its own downfall. At approximately noon on August 24th, 1944, 129 American aircraft converged over the camp and rained down their fury, dropping 1,000 bombs and incendiaries and successfully destroying a munitions factory attached to the Buchenwald complex. That factory had been their primary target, but there were additional casualties. 100 SS men, nearly 400 camp inmates, and the old oak tree, which had been scorched by flames. The camp leadership had it felled and sawed for firewood, but one resourceful inmate named Bruno Appitz, a communist prisoner who had survived in the camp since the year it opened, managed to smuggle back to his barracks an entire block of the tree's heartwood. With his fellow prisoners standing guard, Appitz risked his life to carve from the wood a bas-relief in the form of a death mask. He called it Das letzte Gesicht, the last face. This simple, rough-hewn sculpture, later smuggled from the camp and now owned by the German Historical Museum, individualizes the enormity of Nazi violence through the prism of a single face. It can be thought of as among the early memorials to the Second World War and to the events that years later would be called the Shoah or the Holocaust. The grief that lines this last face is grief for all that died at Buchenwald, for the inmates, but also perhaps for what the oak represented. That is, the grand European promise of a high culture of poetry, music, and literature, and the very idea of a humanism that might one day unite all people as equals. From Hiroshima to Nanjing to Pearl Harbor to the killing fields on the Eastern Front, the Second World War was a global catastrophe and a tear in the fabric of humanity. Somewhere near the center of this darkness was the Holocaust itself, an event that continues to haunt Western society's historical memory, just as experiences of trauma may haunt individual memory. It has been likened to an earthquake that shattered all the instruments designed to record it. One of those instruments was art, and in the post-war years, it lay shattered too. Theodor Adorno, the German Jewish philosopher, critic, and musical sage, famously pronounced that to write poetry after Auschwitz would be barbaric. Yet Adorno returned many times to the question of art in the wake of atrocity, ultimately revising his opinion to honor art's power of witness. In 1962, he wrote, "The concept of a resurrection of culture after Auschwitz is illusory and senseless, and for that reason, every work of art that does come into being is forced to pay a bitter price. But because the world has outlived its own demise, it needs art as its unconscious chronicle." The role of music in particular as an unconscious chronicle, as a witness to history, and as a carrier of memory for a post-Holocaust world is the subject of this book. There are many lighter passages, but that's the one that James wanted me to read.
Because that's what the book's about. I mean, the book is about what can art do, what is art for, and I'm wondering if I know he revised that proposition, Adorno, that kind of, which to me is a very very barbaric thing to say. Actually, like you must stop writing poetry now. Things are too dark. But I was wondering if your whole book, in a sense, is a rebuttal to that, even to that idea, to that proposition. Like there must be art, right? And it must struggle with the deepest and darkest and most inexpressible things.
Or even without struggling, that it somehow embodies this kind of collective memory, this music as culture's memory. This idea that it's not just we who listen to and remember music, but that music also remembers us, that it crystallizes these moments in human society and these earlier eras and these wordless truths from those times and carries them forward.
When you say wordless, rereading the book, I was very struck by is it Moses and Aaron, the Schoenberg?
Schoenberg's opera,
right?
yeah.
Where, who is it who cries out, a word that
Right, so there, Moses, it's Moses at the end,
Yeah.
who's at the end of Act 2, who, yes.
He says, "Oh, word
A word that I lack."
Right.
And
Which is that to me that is kind of the struggle, right? Like, you know, when your vocabulary is broken down, when your musical vocabulary is being broken down by the thing that you're approaching.
absolutely, yeah. I mean, for me, thinking about music in the 20th century and how these 20th century composers sort of carried forward this earlier romantic and in some senses utopian inheritance of music's long 19th century, this idea that it could ennoble all of us and sort of transform our lives, that the part of that romantic thought was also this idea that the romantics loved music because it was this sort of language where languages end, in Rilke's phrase. It was this way of communicating deep thoughts without the semantic specificity of language, and when you bring that inheritance into the 20th century, you had this sense that Schoenberg's character was describing, where you have these kinds of ruptures in the fabric of humanity from these unbelievable wars and the barbarism, and you start thinking about the limits of language in a different kind of way. So all of a sudden, it's not just that music begins where words end, it's also that words stop being able to describe the truth of the world as it exists through these eras.
I don't know if anybody's picking up the fantastic irony of the jazz, the kind of noodly jazz floating in as we're discussing this thing. It's pretty good. Let's break down your structure here a little bit. Let's talk about this kind of zodiac of guys that you've assembled. You got your Strauss, Richard Strauss. You've got your Schoenberg. You've got your Benjamin Britten, and you've got your Shostakovich. Could you talk us through each of them? Why they were magnetic to you, and how they helped you tell the story? So let's start with Strauss, Richard Strauss.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, to speak about them as a group for a moment, in some ways I worked backwards from what were the four of the most kind of iconic and compelling musical memorials written to the Second World War. And that got me most of the way to this group, and the more I thought about it, the more they kind of organized themselves into these two kind of helpful pairings. On the one hand, the whole first part of the book is about Schoenberg and Strauss, so so to speak, Aryan German and a Jewish German or Jewish Austrian. That's Schoenberg, and Strauss being the Aryan, and then on the other half so they're kind of united in this kind of bond. They're not exactly friends, but they're sort of two parts of this equation that are together kind of co-creating modern German culture. And on the second half of the book, you have Britten, an Englishman, and Shostakovich, a Russian, who are themselves bonded very closely. Personally speaking, they have one of the great friendships of 20th century music, even though neither one of them, even though they don't share a common language, and they're writing from either opposite sides of the Iron Curtain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Strauss, tell us about him.
Strauss, yes, he was by far the hardest to write about because he was the most difficult to feel sympathetic towards. He was an extraordinary composer and was the most beloved for his operas, and the greatest living composer in Germany when Hitler came to power in 1933. But rather than go into exile like some of his more principled artistic colleagues did, he stayed in Germany and had a kind of partnership of opportunity with the Nazi regime. From 1933 through 1935, he accepted a really big honorary post as the president of the Reich Chamber of Music, and thought that he was trying to kind of affect these changes in cultural policy that all of a sudden he would have the opportunity to do, and sort of kind of compartmentalized to an incredible degree, sort of thought of the whole anti-Semitic piece of the Nazi movement as a kind of, unsavory and kind of aesthetically in poor taste side of things, but that ultimately maybe it was a conservative traditional government that would help him affect some changes he wanted in music. And even after he realized that they were not that, by that point, he still chose to stay. He had Jewish grandchildren and a Jewish daughter-in-law, and he found himself in this bizarre bind where he had to continue calling in favors with more and more senior Nazi officials in order to keep his own family safe.
I think it's about Strauss, a very, very damning line. He failed to realise or failed to understand that culture and politics had become inseparable.
Yes.
That actually gave me, like, the hairs on the back of my neck went up, because I feel like that's where we are headed quite soon. But that's another discussion. Jeremy gives an incredible account, if you know any writers, of the sort of dissolution of the friendship partnership between Richard Strauss and Stefan Zweig. Can you tell us about that a little bit?
Yeah. So Richard Strauss wrote many of his most famous operas with the librettist named Hugo von Hofmannsthal, and Hofmannsthal died in the late 1920s, and Strauss was totally bereft and thought that he might never write another opera again. And then all of a sudden he discovered Stefan Zweig, who was an Austrian Jewish writer and actually the most translated and most widely read writer of his day, like, bar none, in the German language. And he connected with Strauss, and the two of them embarked on this incredibly fruitful operatic partnership. And together they created, in a kind of record time, this comic opera by Strauss called The Silent Woman, Die Schweigsame Frau. And it was with the libretto by Zweig and the music by Strauss. Strauss loved it. He loved working with Zweig. He thought this is my new creative spring, even though I'm in my 70s by this point, that I have all these new operas ahead of me with my wonderful new librettist. Unfortunately for Strauss, their partnership straddled 1933, when all of a sudden the new government came in, and there is this incredible correspondence where through 33, 34, 35, Strauss keeps trying to say, well, we can keep working together. It's not that big a deal. Oh, don't pay attention to all those pronouncements being made by the Nazis about this and that, or all the boycotts, or we can even just write for the safe, he proposes at one point, and we'll lock up our work until the point.
Zweig was Jewish. Right?
Zweig was Jewish,
yeah.
Right? And so Strauss wanted to work with him in secrecy. Zweig, meanwhile, was really just kind of repulsed by Strauss's failure to recognize, at one point he says, who he is in contrast to them. Zweig admired Strauss enormously as an artist, but was kind of repulsed by his kind of temerity and weakness as a moral human being. And so you see their correspondence documents in some sense the real-time dissolution of sort of symbolically the larger German-Jewish partnership through the prism of these two artists.
Yeah, and these letters are bloody agonizing.
Yeah.
Zweig absolutely contorts himself trying to help Strauss out of the situation that he doesn't even understand that he's in.
Yes, yeah.
And he appeals to his ego. He said, don't let your legacy be this, right?
Right, exactly.
He's very kind of almost sort of
right.
feline in the way he's trying to.
Right.
Let
no one say that you have ever shirked your responsibility,
right.
and things like this.
Right.
And Strauss.
But the guy was obtuse. You couldn't. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
sort
moving right along.
Blinding force of artistic egoism. Right?
That's what I mean. That's why I said, if you know any writers, this is. So Schoenberg, on the other side of the coin,
yes,
with his big bulging, burning eyes in his own bald head, he was an extraordinary character, extraordinary moral character, kind of a moral hero in a way.
Yes.
I mean, he saw very far into the future at a time when a lot of people didn't.
Yeah. I mean, so what was amazing about Schoenberg, who was born in Vienna and just a few years younger than Strauss, born in 1873, and Schoenberg was the one who basically revolutionized modern music. He's the one who kind of the book. It's a thrill to see so many familiar faces in the audience. Full stop. And the book is written for, in a way, for multiple audiences, for people who see themselves as kind of inside the whole music world and already know a lot of this history on one level, hopefully bringing new levels to that knowledge. But then also for people who are completely outside of the music world and have an entry point through interest in history or Jewish culture or literature even. So pardon me for the musicians in the audience if I'm explaining the obvious, but Schoenberg was kind of the great inventor of musical modernism who kind of created the whole idea of atonality and what he called the 12-tone method. So he sort of fashioned himself as the kind of the Moses of modern music and as a kind of prophet for where music was going in its future. And then what happened over the course of the 1920s was that he had this kind of political awakening, and he became incredibly prescient, not only in artistic matters but in political ones. He saw the writing on the wall extremely early. He left Germany in 1933, settled in Los Angeles, and started working with incredible diligence to try to sort of shock the world awake about the impending dangers facing European Jewry. And as brilliant as he was as a composer, he was sort of spectacularly ineffective as a political organizer. And one of the more poignant exchanges that I came across and share also in the book is that he writes to Thomas Mann, who was also in exile in Los Angeles at the very same time, saying, here are my political writings, basically all but predicting the Holocaust in 1938 before Kristallnacht had even occurred. And he has these incredibly prescient political writings that he's trying to get published, and he reaches out to Mann and says, you're a Nobel Prize winning author, do you think that you could help me get this published? And they sort of do a little dance and largely speak past each other, and Mann is ultimately not able or not willing, it's not quite clear, to help him, and those writings ultimately go completely unpublished and unheard until 1970. So that was in some senses a poignant moment where what could have been a second act for this German-Jewish dialogue in exile failed to materialize. Yeah.
The thing I was very struck by in the Schoenberg sections of it were so when he's in Albuquerque. The chapter has got a brilliant title, Moses in Albuquerque, and he's laying on a performance. No, it's not him. Somebody else is doing it, right? A musician down there in Albuquerque with his own chorus, a Jew in exile, right? Sets a performance of a survivor in Warsaw,
From Warsaw.
That's right, from Warsaw. Schoenberg's incredibly challenging memorial, right?
Right.
And so, but it's kind of a hit. It's a weird hit. I mean, the performers become very invested in it, and the community sort of gets behind it. And you make the point that in the wake of some of these events, people are suddenly able to understand Schoenberg's music in a way that they couldn't.
Yeah, absolutely, exactly. So picking up on the theme of his prescience, first it was kind of musical vision in artistic terms, then this kind of political prescience, and then his prescience as a memorialist. So what James is referring to is this piece called A Survivor from Warsaw, which he wrote incredibly early in 1947, before there was a single built monument to the Holocaust anywhere in the country. And this was one of the very first major musical memorials to the Holocaust. And it was so far ahead of its curve that even, this is actually an interesting Boston story, even though it was commissioned by Serge Koussevitzky's foundation right here in Boston, and almost everything that Koussevitzky commissioned through his foundation was premiered with the Boston Symphony. But it seems from the paper trail like Koussevitzky did not understand what he was about to get. And Schoenberg delivers this extraordinarily, not just powerful, but very sort of frontal and bold monument, which features a narrator speaking, a narrator recalling a scene from an extermination camp, and there are references to the gas chambers and all of this. So for it's almost hard to realize, to think about this, because we in some ways we live in such a memory-saturated sort of post-Spielbergian environment now. But back then, Elie Wiesel could not find a publisher for Night Primo Levi could not find a publisher for Survival in Auschwitz, it was really one of the themes of the book is how in every country forgot the Holocaust differently according to its own needs. And so when this piece comes, Kusevitsky doesn't want to touch it. It ends up being essentially orphaned, and then this Austrian Jewish emigre who had sort of washed ashore in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and having fled the Anschluss, he writes to Schoenberg out of the blue saying, I hear you have this new piece. He had no idea what it was, but I hear it's for chorus and orchestra. If it's not too difficult, could I look at the score? And if it's not too difficult, maybe we'll give it a whirl. And Schoenberg writes back, you can look at the piece, but if you want to perform it, you have to create the performance parts, like the individual parts for each of the instruments. And you could just kind of imagine Frederick's eyes, kind of eyebrows arching, he writes back right away, I'm sorry, just to clarify, are you saying that this piece has never been performed before and you're offering myself, Kurt Frederick, and my amateur orchestra, the Albuquerque Civic Symphony, which rehearses and performs, by the way, in a sweat-soaked university gymnasium, literally. Are you saying that we're the ensemble that you're entrusting for the premiere of A Survivor from Warsaw? And he writes back and says yes. So you have this incredible moment in a way in the sort of each of these different pieces open up these incredible windows onto the kind of the social history of memory in these different countries where they have these premieres. So in this case, it shows a lot about how America at that time was grappling with the Holocaust. This premiere happens, and it was a huge hit, as James was saying, and this opens up this whole new way of thinking. Sort of, there's all of a sudden people start looking at Schoenberg's atonal music, so music full of dissonance, and saying, this isn't just a kind of musical aesthetic choice that he's created this dissonance. This is actually music that has all along been seeing through kind of the outer crust of modern society to see these profound contradictions and violent impulses that lay beneath the civilized veneer of modern life. So all of a sudden, Schoenberg becomes this sort of artistic truth teller about actually the way the world is in some tellings, and that kind of vision gets retroactively conferred onto his earlier works. And as Adorno puts it, with Survivor from Warsaw, Schoenberg's music meets the world it had always prophesied.
Give us that incredible quote, Adorno quote, the one that I like.
Yes.
You have it?
I think I have a version of it, yeah. James is asking me to share a quote that I...
It's in this.
Yes. My poor friends have heard me go on far too long about Adorno. And one of the quotes I like to share is just an extraordinary... This sort of distills Adorno's vision for what the purpose of art is, in a way, or in this case, what he calls the purpose of thought. He says that something along the lines, this is in his Minima Moralia, his memoir in fragments, and he has one called Finale, and he says, perspectives must be fashioned that reveal and that estrange the world and reveal it to be with all its rifts and crevices, as distorted as it will one day appear in the messianic light. And he says, and that alone, in a way, to create those.
I mean, it starts so terribly. Perspectives must be fashioned.
Right.
But anyway,
right. And then the second part is that to arrive at these perspectives without doing violence to the world is actually the purpose of thought. And I think he meant to say also the purpose of art.
Okay, now we've got about 5 minutes before we're going to start taking some questions. So I've just got one more question for you, Jeremy, on the personal side of things. You carried this book around inside you for a long time, and this is, as is will be quite obvious, a serious book. Light and darkness are sort of fighting in a whirlwind in this book all the way through. So I want to ask what it meant for you, what it meant for your nervous system to do this work and to bring it to completion so spectacularly. Take as long as you like.
The book is, in a lot of ways, a bringing together of many. It feels like, among other things, a sort of veiled kind of diary of many of the things I've sort of read about and cared about and thought about and listened to, and places I've been over the last decade plus of my life. So James is correct, just to pick up on the personal dimensions of it. I think that for me, I've always experienced music as this incredibly profound medium for meaning, kind of coming from these earlier times, these earlier souls, these earlier moments of joy and suffering from these individuals, from these distant centuries, these transmissions from the past across space and time, and that way of listening, I came to realize eventually was not necessarily something that was universally shared, and that I came to think that in my work as a critic, one of the things that maybe I might be able to contribute was a kind of a sort of opening up of kind of sensibilities for approaching some of this art in particular, and inviting readers to find their own pathways to them, and hopefully to the art, hopefully helped along in some small way by what one can do with one's writing. It is this kind of contradiction, writing about a wordless art. The only thing you have is words. It's all sort of kind of Sisyphean in some nice basic way. But the book is an extension, in some senses, of that wish to open up the power of listening, the power of this art form, and to use it to try to help understand or get our minds around these incredibly tragic times, of course, but precisely at this moment when the living generation, the generation that lived through that era and could tell their own stories about it, is disappearing. So it seemed almost like there was an element of urgency in trying to think about how art in general and music in particular can work as a sort of bridge backward to these earlier times, not only to the tragic elements, but also a lot of the book tries to also resurrect these kinds of, the oak tree in its glory before it was surrounded within the camp. So kind of also looking at these kinds of Enlightenment visions and sort of dreams and prayers of music's long 19th century, and asking whether there isn't something important still to think about and to remember, even though a lot of those visions got sort of buried in the rubble of history.
But your nervous system.
What do you mean, my nervous headaches?
Constipation, symptoms.
All of the above, you know that, James.
Yeah, I got you. Okay, Silas, is that good? Should we start taking some questions? Right on. Who has a question for Jeremy? Yes, please. What do you do with pointers?
Hi.
Hi. So, I have a question. I mean, we're talking about the wordless art that you're describing in your book. Just curious if you have a playlist that you would recommend to accompany the reader.
Absolutely. It's a timely question. We were just trying to deal with that, trying to get something up on the book's website earlier today and the day before. The short version is that the central musical memorials that I write about are all works that there's some wonderful performances just out there on YouTube. I'm working on trying to curate actual particular recordings and make it easier for people to find through the website. It turns out it's not as straightforward as we had thought. We embedded all these Spotify links, and it turns out they've changed their policy, so they don't let you actually play them anymore. They just give you a preview of the track. Short answer is, as you're reading along, it's a pretty safe bet that any piece of music that's referred to is there on YouTube for the finding, and I'll definitely, you can check back on the website, because hopefully we'll solve this problem and get some specific recordings up there. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Susan.
pay for 200. Was this one of the more upsetting episodes to write about in the book? Because it was handled so beautifully.
Thank you. Yeah, what Susan's referring to, because the book was just published on Tuesday, I'm assuming that most people haven't had a chance to look at it yet. What Susan's referring to is that there is, I sort of bring readers with me to some of the most meaningful and relevant sites that are connected to the music. And one of the pieces I write about is the Babi Yar Symphony by Shostakovich, which commemorated or really broke the silence, broke the ban on memory and commemoration that the Soviets had imposed after the war. It's a really incredibly courageous piece because it sort of it was it broke the silence of forgetting that they were trying to impose from above. This after the war, the Soviet efforts to basically erase the memory of the Holocaust on Soviet soil because of all kinds of ways in which acknowledging it would play against Stalin's agenda and his kind of desire to have a new post-war founding myth for the next kind of chapter of the Soviet Union. For all kinds of reasons, he was trying to erase the memory of the Holocaust on Soviet soil. So Babi Yar is a ravine, some of you know, outside of Kyiv, and it was called Kyiv, Switzerland, because it was like really deep, and you could, there was ideas of trying to develop it to a ski slope before the war. Anyway, during the Second World War, during the Nazi occupation, some of you know this, it was the site of one of the worst massacres where over 33,000 Jews were rounded up and killed over the course of 2 days in September 1941, just gunned down into the ravine. This is what gets referred to as the Holocaust by bullets, and it's not something that we think about as often. We tend to think about the kind of industrialized murder that happened through the system of the camps. The Western armies, as some historians have pointed out, never reached these killing fields in the Soviet Union. So in some ways, that's one among many reasons why that history is less part of what we think about when we think about the Holocaust today. So the Soviet Union was so diligent about trying to erase this memory that it wasn't enough to forbid any monuments being built. They actually wanted to wipe the ravine itself off the face of the earth. And they did that by first pumping in all of this silt to try to flood it, and then have it dry and just be kind of a level field that they would then actually turn into a park of culture and recreation was the plan. And there was a huge mudslide. The dam broke. There was a huge mudslide that itself then killed over 1,000 people. It's kind of intensely literal sense of kind of Freud's return of the repressed, very, very powerful moment. But they did ultimately succeed in flattening this landscape. So when you go there today, as I did in 2018, it's now a memorial preserve, Babi Yar Memorial Preserve, but because it's all flat, it's very disorienting because you have no idea actually where the killings happened. And none of that is specified. The moment that Susan's describing is that I went with a guide, a Ukrainian historian who was showing me sort of from the inside about that area, and at one point he led me off the trail, off of the main area, and kind of into this wooded, into the forest essentially around the site, and brought me to this little gully where you could see kind of almost like a remnant gouge, a little place where the earth was still almost trying to remember its former topography, and he kind of lowered his voice even though there was no one around, and said that to the best of his knowledge, based on his archival reconstruction of documents and all of that, that he thought that this was one of the areas where we were standing, where the executions had taken place. And I looked around in that moment, and there was still no monument, no sign. It was very striking because there was all of this trash on the ground from some discarded liquor bottles from, I guess, a party the previous night, and it just struck me how even that just these ways that memory and amnesia can still sort of exist side by side, and the way you can try to kind of recollect some of the moments of this history, but it still sort of slips through your fingers. That specific moment Susan's is describing is where I write in the chapter that it was very powerful for me to see that with my guide, but I also made a promise to myself that before I left Kiev on that visit that I would go back there on my own and just try to see the same site on my own the next day. And when I tried to retrace my steps, I couldn't find it. Yeah. Thank you, Susan, for...
That's what I remember the most, that one moment where you
Yeah.
it was such
Right.
a powerful, loud moment.
Yeah, the way memory is there and it's not at the same time is one of the themes of the book. Sorry. Any other questions? Nathan?
Do you feel like music itself has an inherent moral quality, or is it just reflecting and echoing what's happening at that time? Like, is it driving the
Did you say inherently moral quality?
inherent moral quality
Yeah.
to it? Like, can you listen to other composers of the time that were driving on a different aesthetic in a bad way?
Yeah, a lot of it has been spilled on these questions of music and morality. One of the things, for sure, these older traditions, classical and to some extent romantic composers, definitely saw themselves as, thinking about Beethoven's Ode to Joy and that kind of, that vision of a day when all humans would be brothers again, united as equal. So one of the things in a way that I wanted to think about in writing the book is just, there's a way that when we think about that older music that does have that moral imperative, or that moral vision inside of it, we tend to think of these works, there's this whole rhetoric of the timeless masterpiece, which in a way takes music completely out of time and out of history. And so it's always struck me that it seemed strange to listen to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in the same way before and after the Holocaust. And it certainly seemed like it couldn't possibly mean the same thing. And so one of the projects of the book was trying to introduce these ideas about that music, we can still listen to music as this amazing time-traveling medium from back then to now, but that, I quote the survivor and poet Paul Celan, who talks about how a poem from an earlier era, it travels through time, not above it or around it, but through it. And in this case, his phrase is the 1,000 darknesses, through the 1,000 darknesses of those eras of the last century. So to be able to kind of think a little bit and listen and hear a little bit more deeply, so that music's moral, because if we have the moral vision of those older pieces while thinking of them as completely outside of time, what is that really besides a kind of moral kitsch, and so to restore history to the way we think about music and music to the way we think about history, both of those parts were part of the book. Thanks, Nathan. Yeah.
When I listened to you, it made me think that you were coming out of a tradition that I think is exemplified by people like Eric Auerbach and George Steiner. Can you tell me who your sort of models are or most influenced your background and your development as a cultural historian?
That's a lovely question. Walter Benjamin and Theodor Adorno are both big presences in this book, the so-called Frankfurt School. But for me, and interestingly, I felt the literary inspiration behind this book is the German writer W.G. Sebald, who some of you I'm sure know and some of you don't. He was the author famously of 4 novels, The Rings of Saturn, Austerlitz, and The Emigrants are all by him. He was sort of Germany's, the post-war German, the great German post-war generation kind of poet of memory, and he was an incredible, he wrote fiction that was sort of historic, with all these kind of historical sinews, and for me, the way he took these extraordinarily powerful events, these kind of blinding events, like the Holocaust, like earlier moments of cultural destruction associated with colonialism. And he would sort of take these extraordinary moments of trauma from the past and sort of filter their light through these scrims of prose and of storytelling in a way that you sort of felt the echoes and could respond and relate to them and get your mind around them in a very powerful way. So the way that he wove kind of history and memory and art together was a real inspiration for me. And on a much more mundane level, he does this thing in his work where he puts photos, some of you may know, he embeds uncaptioned photos into his work. And for him, I think it's this whole kind of poetic play of inflecting his writing with the kind of these elements of visual memory. So as a kind of tribute, I also, there are over 50 images in the book that I've decided to put in without captions. And they're all listed in the back of the book if you're curious, but it's also a way of appreciating his approach. He said, when we look back at history, we're always both looking and looking away. Yeah.
I wonder if I can ask another question about Schoenberg. I was trying to presentation, his history. But thinking back, he was born in 74, and he lived in the First World War, and his music changed quite dramatically from pre-war. He's a person who really understands the transitions.
Yeah, so it's been said that, so the question was sort of to help you understand the transitions of, do you mean sort of artistically, his evolution? Yeah, I mean, it's been said that he sort of, more than any other figure, kind of represents the kind of convolutions of Jewish modernity. You know, he was part of this moment, this visionary moment where this idea, he converted in 1897 or 99, somewhere around there, to Lutheranism, and it was this idea that one way out of the kind of the prison of a persecuted past was just to sort of paint one's own exit, paint one's door out of the prison of one's Jewish heritage, and he converted, and it actually unlocked really powerful creative surge for him, and he all of a sudden, right after the conversion, wrote one of his most amazing kind of era encapsulating pieces, the Verklärte Nacht, or Transfigured Night. And so he was really this kind of zealous German for a while, sort of a convert and a kind of Teutonist and a Wagnerian, and he wrote these kind of militantly patriotic pro-German letters during the First World War, calling the French and everyone else barbarians, and he knew it through their music a long time ago. You know, he got really swept up in all of that, and then there were a series of events in the 1920s where he basically had encounters with anti-Semitism and sort of came to reckon with this fact that whether or not that there was actually not a way out in the way that he had originally thought, and that whether or not he chose to identify as a Jew or not, that identity was going to be thrust upon him with a sort of violent force at that moment. And it's interesting, when Adorno writes about Schoenberg, he talks about him as a man without origins. Adorno's really into Schoenberg's idea, this kind of sees him as this, almost like this cipher of musical progress, this kind of figure through which music history marched into its future. And this book kind of pushes back a little bit against that and tries to, in some way, talk about the ethnic journey and the ethnic roots, Schoenberg's ethnic roots, that the pain surging beneath the dissonance that he unleashed in his early modern experiments was, among many other things, it was a pain about the reality of the modern world and modern life and all of these things, but it was also a kind of socio-ethnic pain that, the big phrase was that he emancipated dissonance in his music, but that the book suggests that his emancipation of dissonance was also a way of holding a mirror to the failures of Jewish emancipation. Yeah.
One more question.
First of all, civilized here is one of those beautiful things I've heard in a long time. Thank you. I'm curious how you chose these four and how Wagner and others didn't make them into the list.
Yes. Right. So I was was, in some senses, it was easy to narrow things because I wanted composers who lived through the era of the war before they could, before they memorialized it. So I wanted 4 composers who sort of carried and inherited all of this utopian ideas about what art could do from the 19th century, and kind of brought that into the sort of the maw of these 2 world wars, and so you could kind of trace through their lives and through their art what happened to those ideas and those ideals. And then, as we were talking about, sort of work backwards from what some of the most compelling musical memorials out there, and are. There are lots of other books that find pieces that you've never ever heard of. This is not one of those books. This is really some of the most famous musical memorials of the 20th century, but kind of going in through the prism, almost like looking at these works as kind of keyholes that you can peer through and open up this kind of vast world of culture and of memory and of these lives, both of the composers, but also all of these figures and these cultures that sustain them.
Okay, everyone, let's hear it for Jeremy.